O Lord, may the words of my mouth, meditation of each and every one of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, for you are our strength and our Redeemer. For the last few weeks, we have been reading the story of Ruth. Now, if you recall the story, there's a woman, Naomi, and she had a couple of sons, and her sons got married to two women, one of which being Ruth. They had moved because of a famine to follow to a place where there was some food so they could live and eat. And while there, both of Naomi's husband had died, and then her two sons had died. And they heard the famine was over, so they went back to Judah. But as they were going, Naomi turned around and said to her daughters-in-law, go back to your father's houses so that you can get a husband. I don't have any more children to marry you. And even if I were to get a husband today and to have children right away, would you wait till they grew up? Now see, that's all related to the Jewish custom that was spelled out in the law. That if a man married a woman and he died without them having any children, that his brother was supposed to lie with his wife so that she would become pregnant and bear a child, and that child would then be the brother's legal offspring. So his name would not die out of Israel. They didn't have last names. And that was that tradition. It's very weird to us. Can you imagine yourself if your husband died and then his brother came over and said, I'm all ready to do the duty of a brother. Yeah, it wouldn't go over real big these days. This would not be the kind of thing that would be embraced wholeheartedly. Might be in a couple of places, but that just makes it worse.
What if you don't like him?
Yeah, well, you didn't have a choice.
Yeah.
See, under that custom, you didn't have a choice. But in this case, Naomi didn't have any other sons. So she cared very much for her daughters-in-law. And her way of thinking was, you know what, if they go back to their father's house, then their father can arrange another marriage for them. Because they couldn't get a job. Women could not work in that society. And they had no way to support themselves. So they would have been, like the introduction said, destitute. Totally impoverished. So out of her care and concern, she tried to get them to go back. And the woman does, but Ruth would not leave her.
No.
And so Ruth stayed with her, and they went back to Judea. Now, Naomi wants to do what she can for Ruth. So they've got this kinsman, a relative, named Boaz. He's a pretty well-off guy. He owns fields and all this kind of stuff. And Ruth had been gleaning in his fields. Now, gleaning was, when you went through and you harvest your field, you didn't go all the way to the end. You left a little bit growing around the edges. And as your folks were picking up the harvest, if they dropped anything, they were to leave it there. And the law says to do this, and it says that the reason is so the poor will be able to have something to eat. They can come in and they can glean the field and pick up these leftovers. And that's what Ruth was doing. That's how she was making a living. Well, she goes home and Naomi said, you know what? Boaz, good-looking guy. Got some coin. You should you've met him already. What do you think? Hot, isn't he? Yeah, so you should do something to get his attention. This reading is what happens. She says, he's going to be over at the threshing floor. He's going to be there. Go there and kind of hide in the shadows. And after he eats and he drinks and he goes to lie down, goes to bed, go over and uncover his feet. It doesn't mean feet. It means uncover his, that. That's what, when the Bible says uncovered feet, that's what it's referring to. So she goes over and she uncovers his feet and lays down next to him. Kind of you think he knew her intention? And then there's this big piece that we skipped over this morning. And it talks about how they come together and how he ends up taking her as his wife. And that she has a kid who ends up being grandfather to David, King David. The book of Ruth is right after Judges, where all the judges run, and then 1 Samuel starts next. And that's the initial part of Samuel the prophet. is born and becomes God's prophet, and then he anoints David to be Saul first, and then David to be king over Israel. So this kind of makes a connection here between the lineage. And so Ruth becomes Boaz's wife, and she becomes the great-grandmother of David. This whole book is predicated on the fact that widows were destitute, that they had nothing. They had nothing to live on. They couldn't work. If they didn't have children, there was nothing that they could hope for. Best case scenario is sit beside of the road in bed. That's your best case. Pretty lousy best case. The gospel lesson, we've got something related to that. And Jesus had been at the temple precincts. Scribes and Pharisees tried to trick him with these trick questions to try to undermine his standing with the crowds. They asked him a question, and they were hoping that he would give an answer that would tick people off so he would be so popular. Failing that, they were hoping he'd give an answer that the Romans would look on as being illegal and would get arrested. But every time they tried this, he came up with an answer that just like blew everybody away. So they finally stopped asking him questions. Except one guy heard this and he came over and he said, "No, what's the most important commandment in the law?" And Jesus says, number 1, love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, all your strength. And the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. And on these 2 commandments hang everything. All the law, all the prophets, everything comes right from those. It kind of makes it easy on us, but we've got to remember too, right? Now, this morning, Jesus is in that same place immediately after that. And he's sitting there and he says, "You've got to watch out for the scribes and Pharisees." And he says he's saying this to his disciples. You know, you and I think of the 12. But Jesus had a lot of people following. And a lot of the disciples, the 12 were the apostles, were kind of the inner circle. But he had a lot of others who followed him. And he said to the scribes, watch out for these guys. Because they are all about status and power. You know, they love to have special seats at the big events and have people talk about how wonderful they are. That is what they are about. That's where their concern is. And you know what? They get that, so they got what they wanted. You got to look at things otherwise. And then they go and they sit down. And they're sitting near the offering box. There was a box in the temple where people would drop in money. And some wealthy people are coming by and they're taking large sums of money. And because their main thing is to be seen by people, they make a big show of dropping it in. You know, the offering plate goes like, let me count out what I'm putting in, man. And then he sees this poor widow come up. Very quietly, not calling any attention to herself. She comes up to the box and she drops in 2 little copper coins. The Bible tells us they're worth a penny. And Jesus called his disciples together and he said, you see what she gave? She gave more than all of the other people combined. Now you got to figure, these guys making a big show, they're going to be dropping in, $30, $40, $50, maybe more. And she puts in a penny. How is a penny more than $50? I don't know. I'd like to be able to figure out that math. It would make the bill paying a heck of a lot easier. But Jesus wasn't talking about money. He was talking about trust and reliance on God and the importance of the things of God. I know a woman who had been alienated from her family. There had been things that had happened over the years. She was kind of isolated. She was probably in her 80s. Sweetheart. Absolute sweetheart. Loved the lady. When the offering plate would go around in church, she put in a couple of dollars. I know that only because I happened to see it one time. And I knew what her financial situation was. It wasn't real good. She did have her own place. She was able to get by, but she always struggling and scraping. Sometimes we give her food from the pantry. That money that she put into the plate she was able to do because she skipped lunch one day during the week in order to give something to God. When I read this story about this poor widow giving everything she had to live on, that woman's face flashes into my mind. Because she gave sacrificially, meaning she gave up something in order to give something to God. Whereas the people dropping in their $50 bills and all that kind of stuff, oh, here comes the offering plate. Let's see, what do I got in here? Yeah, you know what, we're going out tonight. We're doing something. Yeah, you know what, I can afford this. Pull it out and drop it in. No thought. Not about God. More about obligation to an institution. Giving out of their abundances, the way Jesus put it. They had more than they needed, and they gave a little bit of that. And it didn't affect their lives at all. Does that mean that we should all give so that we can't live? Is that what's being said? I don't think that's the case. I'll tell you why I don't think that's the case. Jesus talks about which one of you, when going to build a tower, doesn't sit down and calculate the cost first. Because otherwise, you start building, you run out of money halfway through, and all your friends laugh at you because you didn't bother to figure. Very prudent, practical way of looking. Their responsibilities for taking care of your wife and female children, because they would be destitute otherwise, right? The law lays out that in the event that a father dies, the estate is divided up among the male children, because the female children are going to get husbands and they're going to take care of them. The oldest child got a double share. And then the rest is divided up among the other brothers. Why did the oldest get a double share? Because he had to take over the father's responsibility of caring for the mother and caring for the rest of the family. There are all these provisions, like these two I mentioned and others, that talk about the responsibility we have from a financial point of view of taking care of the responsibilities we have. So to give away everything to God to prevent you from taking care of your responsibilities is not consistent with these things. So that's why I don't think that that's what Jesus is saying. But what I do think Jesus is saying is the offering. Back in Jesus' day, animals, there was a coin box in the treasure in the temple. You brought animal offerings. Today we do money. The offering, and you've heard me say this before, is an act of worship. It's not about paying an electrical bill. It's not about paying for any kind of things concerning the building. Is it used for that? Yes, it is. I'm not going to say it's not. And you know what? We have to hear this one. But that's not the right reason behind it. God has been active in our lives. And I talked earlier about answered prayer. God has been active in our lives and doing things in our lives. And we should say thank you. And one of the ways in which we say thank you is we give something of ourselves. Yes, prayer, but also giving something of ourselves. And that's what the offering is about. That woman, that widow, who brought those 2 copper coins, Jesus said that she gave all that she had to live on. If she gave everything she had to live on, how was she going to live? What was she going to eat? How was she going to take care of herself? Good question, right? She gave all she had to live on. You know what she had to do? She put herself in a position by giving to God to have to rely on God and trust that God would provide for her needs. The rich guys that dropped in all the money, I don't have to worry about God. I can take care of it myself. I got enough money to cover what I... Yeah, exactly. A friend of mine served a church in a pretty wealthy community. I was talking to him one time about doing spiritually meaningful ministry and how that can be very difficult. He said, you know, if the furnace goes out, One of the advantages of being in a community like this, if the furnace goes out, somebody will write out a check to buy a new furnace. We don't have to worry about that. Be nice. Would be nice. He goes, but to get people to understand that they need to rely on God is next to impossible. They think they can rely on themselves because they have money. And so those wealthy people throwing that money into the box in the temple, it was about what people thought of them. It wasn't about saying thanks to God. They didn't have to rely on God. But that woman, she gave in thanksgiving to God, confident that God would take care of her. That God would give her what she needed. And that's what we need to be. Necessarily giving everything you have to live on? No. Actually, the biblical standard for giving is a tithe. It's 10%. So you still have 90%. You can live on 90%. But the idea behind the giving is that we trust God. A woman years ago at annual conference during one of the offerings, and it's changed. We used to have like 20 offerings at annual conference. I tell people who came, make sure you bring a lot of singles to that offering at annual conference. And this one woman got up and said, you know, the one thing that I always notice is that if I pay my bills first, as soon as I get my paycheck, there's never anything left to give to God. But somehow, if I pay God first, the bills get paid anyway. Trusting that God will provide what we need is a major tenet of what it means to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. Have faith that God will take care of you and make sure you have what you need. Maybe not what you want, but God will give you what you need. So as you go through your weeks and you get your paychecks and you start to figure out what you're going to do with the money and all this kind of stuff, keep first things first. The idea behind the tithe is you give to God first before you give to anybody else. Because God is the number one priority. For this widow, God was the number one priority. And that meant that she had trust that God would take care of her. So make God your priority and trust that God will take care of you. The Bible tells you He will. But do you really believe it? This widow did. She demonstrated. Are you going to demonstrate the way you use your talents and your time and your resources? Trust God and deepen your faith. Let's pray. Lord God, we give you thanks for your presence with us, for your assurances that you will always take care of us, for your presence with us, and for the deepening discipleship that comes from being trusting of you. Thank you, God, that our lives are rich. We, by accident of birth, have been born in an area where there are more resources than we could possibly use. And God, while that is a blessing, it's also a curse. It allows us to trust in stuff and to think that stuff can save us and take care of us, when really that kind of security only comes from trusting you. So work in our hearts to keep us mindful of that fact, that we might grow in our faith and become more obedient disciples as we strive to live out our lives in this world. And God, as we do strive to be more faithful, we become concerned about those who are ill, those who are poor, those who are lonely, because those are your concerns. But for many of us, faces pop into our minds when we think about those things, because we know people who are struggling in all those areas. So we come to you raising their names in trust, knowing that you will take care of what is needed, and that Our friends and neighbors and acquaintances will be blessed by your presence.